Welcome to the Social Impact Journal, the podcast where I talk to change makers around the world driving social impact. My name is Jack Farron and I'm your host. If you enjoy this episode, please do share with your colleagues and friends and make sure to follow us on our social media channels. It helps us more than you know. This week, I'm with Louise Savell. She is the Director of Social Finance, a not-for-profit consultancy based in the UK that partners with a variety of stakeholders to develop solutions that address social challenges in the UK and abroad. Louise, thanks so much for coming on the show. So today we'll be talking about outcomes-based approaches. But I think before we get into that, I know you work for social finance. So I gave a little bit of an introduction there, but what is social finance?
Yeah, great question. I was very privileged to be there on the ground floor when we started it back in 2007. We're a non-profit advisory organisation. An unusual one because we're financially regulated. But the reason we're financially regulated is because one of the tools that we try to use in terms of driving social impact and supporting our partners to drive social impact is to really think about finance and funding as well as all the other things that make social programs work around governance, legal and contracting, data, and partnerships. As you say, we work in the UK, we work a lot with government and non-profits, social enterprises and impact investors here. But we also work internationally, and the team that I jointly lead focuses on our work with low and middle income countries, where we work with donor agencies, philanthropies, service providers, governments, to really try to bring together effective cross-sector partnerships to deliver real change.
Amazing. So you mentioned 2007 is when the organisation started. But if I'm correct, 2010 is when social finance developed. Was it the first in the world social impact bond?
Yes, that's right. It was 18 months or so in the works before we launched it. But so when we started work, when we started the organisation, we were UK focused at that time. And that was the time of the end of the last Labour government, or towards the end of the last Labour government. And they were very focused on thinking about how could they contract for the social programs in the UK in a way that was results based. And one of the observations we had around that, and we were set up really when we started to think about how can we support UK based charities and social enterprises to access the funding they need to deliver impact. And one of the things that we saw as a risk in terms of that shift, if you like, towards results based funding was, lots of non-profit organisations can't afford to take the risk of being paid on outcomes. They don't have the kind of money that they would need to deliver first and be paid later. And so that was really part of the thinking around the genesis of the impact bond approach, was to think about, could we get impact investors who are looking for a social and a financial return to provide non-profits with effectively the cash flow to deliver services up front on the basis that then government could pay them on the basis of the results that they achieve. Okay. So you keep that element of accountability for end user results, but at the same time solve the cash flow issue for non-profits.
Yeah. So how did that work in practice, the first project through the bond?
Yeah, so the first social impact bond was launched with the Ministry of Justice. It was focused on prison leavers from Peterborough Prison who'd served short sentences, so had prison sentences of under 12 months. And there was no support for that population, no statutory support for that population at the time when the project was launched. And yet that population had very, very high reoffending rates. So the chances they would end up back in the justice system at some point in the next couple of years after their release was very high. So we worked with that population. We raised impact investment to fund a coalition of providers, recognising that actually the support needs of a prison leaver could vary radically. Some might need literacy and employment support. Some might need support around substance misuse or some other form of rehabilitation. Some might need support to reconnect with families and children. And really, actually, what's needed was a sort of person-centered approach to supporting that population that could be quite flexible based on what specific individuals needed. And so we raised impact investment, funded a range of services for that population through it. And then the outcomes of the population were measured relative to a control group, a virtual control group. So from the population of short sentence prison leavers as a whole across the national population. And it delivered great results. So yeah, it was really exciting as a first project.
So if I'm a service provider that's offering those skills to prison leavers, so being part of the bond, so you get paid from the impact investor to deliver the services, so that sorts the cash flow, and then the impact investor is paid by the government on the outcomes.
That's right. So in that example, the impact investor was fully taking the risk. It was a very different kind of investment risk, I think it's fair to say, to anything that any of them had taken on before. For that reason, the investors in that program were largely philanthropic foundations investing from either their grant pots, or actually some of them did it from their endowments. But were very mission aligned. They were taking risk on whether outcomes they cared about could be delivered. But you're absolutely right. From the service provider point of view, they were getting their costs covered up front. And what was really interesting, I think, about the model is that it created a really collaborative cross-organisation approach, which is not commonly seen in this sector. I think we often see, because of the way that funding moves, social sector organisations having to compete with each other for a finite pot of funding. And actually what was really nice in this was because there was a really clear shared objective that we were all working towards as a group. Actually, there was a huge amount of data sharing, a huge amount of coordination, a huge amount of collaboration in support of the outcomes for the population we were working with.
Yeah, it's not just about delivering the activities, it's actually then collaborating to achieve the outcomes that have been set out. So you said that now you're working on the international development team in low and middle income countries. So there'd be a lot of listeners of this show that are interested on this topic. Maybe it's something quite new for them and they're looking to learn more. So how would you define an outcomes-based approach after we've just covered the first, social impact bond?
Yeah, it's a great question. So outcomes-based, social impact bonds are a subset, if you like, of what we would classify as an outcomes-based approach. So an outcomes-based approach is a broader set of approaches. And I guess their defining feature is really that they try to create accountability around what happens in terms of service users and what changes in their lives. Yep. Now, that doesn't sound like rocket science, and certainly results-based finance isn't new in the international development space. But I think what is really new and what does differentiate outcomes-based approaches from the broader set of results-based finance or performance-based finance contracts is that the majority of what we see in the sector trigger payments based on service provider activities. Have you delivered X number of training courses? Well, Y number of computers brought to a particular health centre or a particular school. Yep. And actually outcomes-based contracts say, that's great, but that's a means to an end. What we care about are the people you've trained achieving jobs, are the children in those schools achieving better literacy and numeracy outcomes. So it's shifting the emphasis, if you like, to what's really changing in the lives of the people we're trying to help.
Yeah. Amazing. So I know social finance have worked on projects, all over the world, on these areas. So let's talk about a few examples. Do you have any case studies to share where the outcomes-based approach was the right approach to go for, and then talk through, the procedure of, how partnerships come together, how the project is implemented, and then how eventually outcomes can be created through that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important point, Jack, which is that these are at their heart cross-sector partnerships, and really thinking about the mechanics and what your levers are to get those cross-sector partnerships working effectively is absolutely at the heart of what we do every day. I think we've seen some really exciting examples of where that's worked. across a really wide range of contexts, both in terms of sectors and geographies. So among the projects that we've supported have been an outcomes-based top-up to a social enterprise approach to delivering or increasing latrine use in rural Cambodia. That was really interesting because it was largely a user-paid model, but actually for some populations in more rural areas, there was a difference between what households could afford to pay and what the service cost to deliver. So we looked at using outcomes-based funding as a top-up to that, and that worked really well. Equally, we've done some really interesting work in the West Bank around employment for young people and particularly women. That was a really exciting example. It launched just as COVID was hitting in March 2020. And, these contracts are designed to adapt, but they were not designed to adapt to that extent. I think what was really great about the outcomes approach in that context was that the outcomes payments were based on the jobs that were secured and the jobs that were sustained, but they weren't tied to a particular sector. So when we supported the design of the project, we had thought we're going to be looking at jobs in IT, we're going to be looking at jobs in tourism. COVID hit and everything closed down, but actually we were able to achieve the outcomes through that program. It's just that the jobs that were being secured were in healthcare and logistics. But it was a really nice example of how the model could flex because there was a focus on what's changing in the service user lives, but less of a focus on how that change was being achieved. The contract was able to really still deliver its social impact in spite of the radical change to the context in which the program was being delivered. And then I think, equally we have sometimes worked with the public sector in different ways. So in Cameroon, we supported the structuring of a project to help the Ministry of Public Health to improve neonatal survival outcomes in public hospitals. And that looked at bringing in a new model supported by a non-state, non-profit that was training public sector clinicians to deliver. And then, we're equally exploring options where the public sector is delivering directly. And sometimes that doesn't include financial incentives. Sometimes that might include incentives in kind. So I think there's a really broad range of ways that this approach can be applied.
Definitely. So let's start with Cambodia. So you have the outcomes top-up approach for the social enterprise. So you see they're offering the service which is fully paid by a certain segment of the population, and then maybe in more rural areas, you said that there's that gap there in terms of what households can pay. So talk me through the procedure and the process of what that looks like to get a partnership off the ground. If you can kind of give me a 60-second, whistle, tour through that partnership and. What does it take to actually bring that to life?
Yeah, well, that partnership was really exciting because it was one of the quickest partnerships that we'd managed to launch. There is nuance involved in getting these partnerships off the ground because, it does sometimes take time to get all partners to agree on a common objective around which the program can be centered. In that case, there was a foundation, the Stone Family Foundation, a philanthropic foundation who had been grant funding the top-up and some of the service costs for a locally based provider, IDE, for a while. They were conscious that the program was getting to a scale that they potentially couldn't support any longer, and yet the model had been proven to be really effective. So what they were looking for was essentially a bigger donor to come alongside them to provide that some kind of funding to support the program to scale. So we were really lucky to be able to bring USAID in to provide the outcomes-based funding top-up. They were excited because it was a more cost-effective model for them than models that they had funded in the past. the Stone Family Foundation switched from being a grant funder of the social enterprise to providing impact investment. So for them, it was a much more sustainable way to continue to support the organisation and the impact to scale.
Definitely.
And the organisation, IDE, was then able to continue to build out its delivery in rural villages.
Yeah, because if you're the family foundation there, and it's still for them, they're granting the top up, so they're really they're not paying for everything, and they're seeing that. But as the program scales, as you say, it's going to become very expensive. So I think that's interesting to see from different stakeholders how an outcomes based approach can be effective. Now let's look at when it's not financial. So you said in the program with public sector in healthcare, what kind of non-financial incentives have you seen that have been layered into outcomes-based approaches?
Yeah, so I guess the primary non-financial incentive, particularly for the public sector clinicians in that, was a desire that they had to see neonatal survival rates improving. And when the programme started, the country had very, very high neonatal mortality rates, particularly among infants who were born either early or with a very low birth weight. So I think, we had a set of very motivated clinicians. I think, one of the intervention that was being supported via the nonprofit was a very low resource. It was very well suited to a low resource healthcare setting. So it was based on effectively scaling out a skin to skin care model for neonatal care. As opposed to a more expensive and actually less effective incubator-based model. But as part of rolling these services out through public sector health settings, there was clearly a sort of minimum level of neonatal unit functionality that had to be there. And so from the public health clinicians' point of view, they were not only, I think, getting the rewards in terms of seeing neonatal survival rates improving, they were also benefiting from some additional in-kind support for their facilities that might be around more reliable access to drinking water for all patients in those units, or sometimes we were having to look at generators that would smooth out potential issues with electricity supply. There was obviously a lot of training and ongoing continuing professional development for the clinicians in that setting, and they had opportunities to travel to hospitals in other regions to learn from how the program was operating there. So I think there are a lot of capacity benefits, I guess, in addition to the financial structures that sit around and maybe operate outside the delivery context itself. Yeah.
So when you're assessing a new potential project, what are the key factors that you would look at to see, whether an outcomes-based approach would be the right fit for that program?
Yeah, it's a really great question, and I think potentially esoterically, we tend to think about this in terms of uncertainty and levels of uncertainty. And so, if a program has a really clear cause-effect chain that you absolutely know that if you deliver a particular intervention, you're going to get to a certain population outcome. A vaccination program might be a good example of this. Actually, you probably don't need an outcomes-based approach to funding that, because you can fund that using grant finance. You have a very high level of confidence that if you fund a set of activities, those activities will lead to a particular outcome. Yeah. At the other end of the extreme, I guess, you have contexts where, as I was saying, you've got a lot of uncertainty around either what intervention will work for a particular population, maybe you just don't know, or you do have a good level of cause-effect certainty around an intervention, but there's a huge amount of volatility in the operating context. Could be for a range of reasons, political, environmental, etc. But for whatever reason, you have a a very high level of volatility that you expect to have to respond to. I think in those contexts, it can be hard for service providers to feel like they have enough control over whether outcomes will be delivered for an outcomes-based contract to make sense. So I think the sweet spot for outcomes-based approaches sits somewhere in the middle of those two things.
Uncertain, but not too uncertain.
And sometimes it will be that you have, a really nicely evidenced intervention, but it's only been evidenced at a small scale, and you're wanting to take it to a much bigger scale. So there's a reasonable level of it's reasonable to assume that you might have to change quite a lot in terms of how you're actually implementing it in order for it to work at that different scale. In other contexts, it might be that, in fact, the Cameroon neonatal health example is a good example of this. There was a really great track record around the impact of that program in Colombia, but it hadn't been trialled in Cameroon before. And so that was taking a program that we knew worked in one context to a context where actually the baseline health sector looked very different. The whole operating context looked very different. So there was a level of both uncertainty, but also a reasonable expectation of a need to adapt how delivery was managed in that context. So I think those are the kinds of ways that we think about it. And then I think, there are examples where even something as sort of where the cause effect link is very solid, like a vaccination program, the mainstream program might work to reach 80, 90% of the population, but actually the last 10, 20% might be much harder to reach. That could be for cultural reasons. It could be for access reasons. They might be in very rural, mountainous areas of a country. In those contexts, even where there's a very strong cause-effect relationship in terms of the specific intervention, you may nonetheless want to incentivize innovation, if you like, around how the last mile delivery takes place.
Great. What are the factors then? So we have the level of uncertainty. What else would you be looking at?
Yeah, I think other things that we really think about are, does anyone care enough about this to pay for outcomes? That's really important. And also, can all of the stakeholders that would need to be involved in the delivery of a program agree what success looks like?
Okay.
Again, it sounds self-evident, but actually is often, particularly if you're contracting around those things, not so easy to get to that. So I think, having a very clearly defined target population, so whose outcomes you're responsible for achieving, having a really clear shared vision, shared definition of what success looks like, and having someone on board or partners on board who are willing to pay for success. Those are really the foundations that we look for. And then obviously we will work from that to say, okay, are there service providers who have a really great track record of working either in the particular geography or with this particular population? How can we bring often consortia of providers together to work together to support these outcomes to be delivered? And then, careful thinking about what's the right level of timing for a program. It needs to be long enough that you can achieve outcomes, but generally speaking, particularly if there's an investor involved, they don't want to be investing in early childhood education on the basis that they'll get paid when children get to 16 or 18 and hit the job market. So you have to look at slightly more kind of short-term metrics of success at that point.
And I think you mentioned the track record of service providers, but also the capacity, because it's not easy funding for those organisations. So how do you? I think I'd like to touch on localization, in a few minutes, and how this approach could potentially help community-based organisations. But from what you've just mentioned there around track record and capacity, it's a challenge, right? It's not easy funding for those service providers.
No, I think that's right. It's quite a radically different type of funding to the grant-based funding or fee-for-service funding that most service providers will be used to. It's different in a few different ways. I think it's quite exposing. There is genuine accountability for whether the services you're delivering are achieving change in service user lives. Some organisations may feel very confident around that, may have evaluations that show that they're very good at doing that. Others may never really have evaluated that in quite such a robust way in the past. And so, there's definitely a consideration around that. I think there's also a real shift in culture internally as well that we see in a lot of service providers, whereby data goes from being something that is collected and reported retrospectively to funders to show what has happened to actually becoming a real tool for management to inform what they're doing on a day-to-day basis. Some management teams are really excited by that, and we've worked with a number of organisations who just have now rolled that out as a way that they work much beyond an outcomes-based contract per se, really using real-time data to learn about where they're being effective, who they're being effective for, and to make changes in real time to try and improve that. But, it is a very different way of working, and it needs to flow through all the way from senior decision makers all the way down to your frontline teams. So it isn't going to be right for every organisation, and potentially organisations taking these kinds of contracts on for the first time may have to invest in setting up the systems and the decision-making processes in order to support that.
Yeah. So if we look at localization then, and how these approaches could potentially support localization, what do you see as potential areas and also barriers?
Yeah, well, it's a great question, because I think we definitely see localization as, along with a lot of other actors in the development sector at the moment, a really, really important direction to be moving in. And we also recognise that it's much as there's a lot of great talk about this, particularly from donor agencies, actually the reality in terms of the amount of funding that's moving in that direction is that it hasn't been a massive percentage of funding moving in that way to date. And there are some really good reasons for that, and there are some more frustrating reasons for that. But I think, fundamentally, there's a disconnect between the ways in which large donor agencies want to see their fundee organisations operating in terms of really robust finance systems, really robust data systems, a lot of capacity and often a lot of time invested in reporting to them about what's happening, and the capacity of community-based organisations to actually do that. So I think one of the things that we think might be really exciting is to look at, actually how could larger NGOs or potentially international NGOs support those partners through, thinking about walking that line, I guess, in a slightly different way between such that maybe they're supporting access and capacity to finance and HR systems, data systems that CBOs wouldn't otherwise be able to access, but are also providing due diligence and accountability, supporting those partners to deliver outcomes. So I think, for us, everything we do at Social Finance is really fundamentally about whether it's through an impact bond, an outcomes-based contract, or through just more effective governance, more flexible contracting, better use of data. It's all pushing in that direction of increasing accountability for end user outcomes. And I think, there are ways in which we think that could be really exciting and as part of that localization shift, so that it doesn't just become a matter of how do you get more funding flowing through those organizations, but you're actually kind of shifting the conversation to say, well, how do you get better impact through funding those organizations? And we should be able to, right? These are the organizations that know the communities. You know this, Jack, through your own work, right? So it would be fantastic to see things moving in that direction.
Yeah, I think you touched on something really important there in terms of what the donor agencies expect from their fundees and the capacity that community-based organisations currently have. Where is the middle ground? Because it's there needs to be a middle ground, and what do you think is needed to bring that? Of course, there needs to be maybe changes of behaviour from large donor agencies to understand the capacity of community-based organisations, but also, I think, as you mentioned there, the large NGOs, international NGOs, in building that capacity due diligence to, bring, maybe a halfway house or, somewhere near there.
Yeah, I think it's a really challenging line to walk. It's completely understandable that where donor agencies are dispersing effectively taxpayer funds, that they require some level of accountability, financial accountability around how those funds are used. And the impact that they're creating. I think there's also a reality that most community-based organisations are unlikely to have the capacity to build those systems or the funding to invest in building those systems. Yep. So I think, as you've said, I think we see there being potentially a really important intermediary role that larger NGOs and INGOs could play in bridging that gap. Yep. Those organisations have those systems at the moment for their own operations. It would require a shift in a different direction for them as well, actually, to be thinking about how do they deliver through community-based organisations rather than delivering frontline services themselves. Yeah. But, in principle, it feels like they might be well positioned to do that. Because I think, the reality is it's hard to imagine large donor agencies having enough staff with enough capacity, if you like, on the ground to be able to provide the support to community-based organisations that they need, at least to make that transition. I think it's plausible that there may be a graduation model whereby over time those organisations build a track record and find a way to access systems in a way that enables them to contract directly with governments and donor agencies. But there might be a bridge step to support them to get to that. And I think it's always important to think about what that runway looks like.
Yeah, it's a fascinating topic. But where does an outcomes-based approach come into this? If you're a community-based organisation, where could you see this going in the coming years?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we see outcomes-based approaches as being really important for is creating flexibility of approach. Yeah. And I think, one of the things that is frustrating to some extent about the way that existing funding flows in the sector is that it tends to want you to know on day zero exactly what you're going to have to deliver over the next 2, 3, 5 years and exactly how you're going to deliver it in order to achieve the project impact that you're aiming for. The reality that all of us that have worked on the ground understand is that things change all the time. Population needs change all the time, and the context in which you're operating changes all the time. And so actually, I guess where we see outcomes-based approaches potentially playing a role is to create that space for community-based organisations to really respond to the needs in their community as they're seeing them on a day-to-day basis, as opposed to how they projected that they would look 3 years earlier when they put together a proposal for funding. So I think, to some extent, that's the same reason that we would see for bigger organisations to use them too. I think in the outcomes-based contracting space, people often get slightly distracted, if you like, by the funding and financing flows, because they are different to more conventional contracts. But for us, I guess the core rationale for using them is that space for adaptation, that space for change, whilst ensuring that there's also accountability. So it's how do you walk that line between space for change and also accountability for funding and impact. Yeah.
Probably evidenced by what you mentioned with the project where COVID hit and the outcomes were based on jobs in tourism and then, just a slight shift to healthcare as an outcome. So, it's still jobs, but it's that element of flexibility. So if someone's listening today and they are thinking, we're a service provider and we may be fit for this type of approach, what do they do? What's that first step if they've never engaged in it before?
Yeah, so I think there are absolutely steps that organisations can take towards working in a more outcomes-based way that don't rely on you having a contract that pays you for outcomes. So I think, some of these I've touched on already, which are things like really shifting the way that you use data as an organisation such that you're fine using it for post hoc reporting, but actually also using it for day-to-day management decision. What is the dashboard of information that you as a management team need to have to decide whether or not the programs you're implementing are having an impact on your service users? So I think that's a really kind of a change that internally can be used by most organizations. I think there are conversations with funders, irrespective of how they are paying you, as to how you can create some more fiscal space for making the change that your data might imply that you need. we have all seen contracts where funders are restricting the amount you can move between budget lines or the amount you can move between budget years. To some extent, that ties service providers' hands behind their back, right? It's all very well saying use data, make changes, but you can only do that if your funding will allow you to do that. So I think, some of the shifts in, even conversations among philanthropies around, how do we fund differently? How does grant funding move differently to create more space, to allow more trust in management teams and to shift the basis of that trust, if you like, I think can be really exciting. And then I guess, thinking about partnerships, I think, as I said earlier, it's very much the case that we see often the way that funding structures are set up creates a sense of competition between non-profit organisations where actually, if we were really honest with ourselves, we would acknowledge that this organisation is great at providing training support, this organisation is great at providing softer skills that individuals might need for employment, this organisation is fantastic at supporting employers to come to the table and consider employing younger people. Actually, we all have different skills. Lots of organisations tend to specialise, and we're more effective if we work together. Those conversations around partnerships can start even if funding isn't being triggered on an outcomes basis.
Fantastic. So I have two questions that I'd like to ask you before we finish the episode. So the first is, you've been with social finance and seen so many types of outcomes-based approaches, but in many different sectors and countries. So maybe just to reflect, what is some of your kind of favourite experiences at social finance? Maybe one or two favourite experiences.
Gosh, yeah, like you say, I've been there over 16 years, so there've been a lot. I mean, I think for me personally, the neonatal health program in Cameroon was a real highlight for me. That program also was operating during COVID, and we had to really work with partners to support thinking about how do we continue to support these outcomes to be delivered in a context where actually the training staff could no longer go to the public hospitals, couldn't travel anymore to the public hospitals in which the services were being delivered. And we had to really think on our feet around that and bring all partners with us to do that. And it was really exciting because the program managed to deliver, better outcomes than we had even predicted at the beginning, in spite of the fact that we pivoted in that way. So I think that was a real highlight for me, both because I cared very deeply about the impact of that program, but also because I guess I was sat at the heart of trying to bring those partner conversations together to really kind of both think through it initially and then radically rethink how we were going to do that. During COVID. So that was a real highlight for me. And I guess, there've been lots, I think, the results of the original Peterborough reoffending program were fantastic to see. We've done work in the UK around reducing numbers of young people that are not in employment, education or training. That's hugely exciting to see. We're doing some exciting work at the moment in the UK with health authorities around community-based approaches to, supporting better health outcomes, and that's really exciting to see. So I think, the model is continually evolving, and I think, I guess that's probably why I'm still there, which is that, we're not just rolling out the same thing again and again. Every project, every program that we do is different. And involves a lot of thinking about what are we trying to achieve socially, and also what's the context in which this partnership is operating, and how do we really structure it to make it work?
For sure. So, Louise, thanks so much for coming on the show. Now, one final question, and this is if you had your own social impact journal and you could write one page in that book for a young professional who is coming into the social impact space generally, or maybe an outcomes-based approach, what piece of advice would you share with them in that journal?
I think there would probably be two things I would say to them. I think the first is don't underestimate the value of being multilingual. And I don't mean by that speaking lots of foreign languages. I mean recognizing that in order to make cross-sector partnerships work, you have to be able to talk to each set of stakeholders in their own language. You have to be able to talk to investors. You have to be able to talk to the public sector. You have to be able to talk to nonprofits and community-based organizations and communities. And those skills are really important, both to ensure that stakeholders understand each other and also to ensure that a program is going to be effective, because you are genuinely all pushing in the same direction. You understand what you're trying to achieve collectively. So I think that would be the first piece of advice I would give them, is really think about and learn how to talk to those different sets of stakeholders. I think the second piece of advice I would give them is, be humble. Don't ever assume when you go into a program that you know what's going to be needed in order for it to deliver effectively. I think what we have seen time and time again is the value of not just thinking about how a program is structured within the confines of the program itself, but really deeply understanding the system and the culture in which you're trying to operate that program. It's one of the things I love. There's always learning to be had from that. But it is also really complicated. So go in with your eyes open, but really listen.
Fantastic. That's a great piece of advice for the journal, especially the multilingual aspect. So for anyone listening that wants to reach out to you via social media or any of the team on social finance, where can they find you?
So we are on socialfinance.org.uk. That's our website at the moment, although we are about to launch a new website. Okay. I think it's going to be socialfinance.international. We will post it on LinkedIn when it's live. Yep. There and on there is my contact details, and the organization's contact details, and loads more information about the kind of work we do and tools for people wanting to think about working in this way.
Amazing. Louise, thanks again for joining me on the podcast, and I'm sure all of your insights and experience will be helpful for our listeners.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for watching the episode with Louise. If you did enjoy the episode, please do share with your networks. It really does help the show as we bring on more guests, more social impact entrepreneurs and social impact leaders. See you next week, Monday at 9 a.m. GMT for our next episode.